There is a simple, brutal, and unforgiving rule that has governed the rise and fall of every major civilization for over 2,000 years. When the value of gold doubles against an empire's currency, that empire is entering its terminal phase. This is not a speculative theory or a vague historical pattern. It is a mathematical certainty, as reliable and predictable as the laws of physics that govern the material world. While the populace and the media will inevitably focus on the surface-level chaos, the political instability, the social unrest, the street-level violence, these are merely the symptoms of a far deeper, more profound disease. The real story, the one unfolding in the quiet corridors of central banks and within the guarded vaults of the ancient wealthy, is the single greatest transfer of wealth in human history. This transfer is not a future event to be anticipated. It has already been triggered. The mechanisms are in motion, and the countdown is underway. You must understand a fundamental, counterintuitive truth. The fall of an empire creates more millionaires than its rise. But this enrichment is not distributed widely or fairly. It is concentrated exclusively in the hands of the few who possess the key, who can read the ancient blueprint for collapse. Hidden within this blueprint, concealed not in secret codes but in the plain sight of historical precedent, is a specific, repeating mechanism that acts as a great sorting algorithm for society. It determines, with chilling efficiency, who will be financially wiped out and who will build generational wealth that lasts for centuries. This mechanism was designed by the powerful for the powerful, and it operates on one simple, relentless fuel: the systematic and deliberate debasement of your money. The establishment, the academic economists, the financial pundits on television, they all preach a gospel of complexity. They want you to believe that global finance is an arcane and impenetrable realm, understandable only by a priestly class of central bankers who manipulate esoteric concepts like inflation targets, quantitative easing, and forward guidance. This is the grand lie, the smokescreen designed to induce paralysis and confusion. The reality is far simpler, far more brutal, and far more personal. When a government runs out of money, it almost never makes the politically difficult choice to cut spending or raise taxes. Instead, it chooses the path of least resistance and greatest deception. It creates more currency out of nothing. It dilutes the value of every single unit of currency already in existence, silently confiscating a portion of your savings, your labor, and your future with every new wave of creation. This is not taxation with representation. It is an invisible theft, a silent financial coup d'etat waged against the citizenry. And this act of debasement has been the fatal repeating flaw of every single empire that has ever stretched its influence across the globe. Throughout this long, bloody history, there has been only one constant, one true and unchanging measure of this theft: gold. Gold is the constant. It is the market's ultimate, final, and terrified vote of no confidence in the management of the state. Gold does not change. It does not rust, it cannot be printed, and its supply increases only marginally each year. The only thing that changes are the currencies used to measure it, and they inevitably always collapse. To truly comprehend the precipice on which we now stand, you must first internalize this blueprint not as a theory, but as a pre-written script. We must become time travelers, journeying back through the centuries to watch this pattern unfold with terrifying consistency. We will witness the silver heart of the Roman Empire rot from within, victim of its own greed. We will observe Spain, drowning in more physical silver than any civilization in history, paradoxically collapse into poverty and irrelevance. We will see the ingenious Ming dynasty in China attempt the ultimate act of financial arrogance, believing it could replace tangible metal with paper promises. And we will watch it pay the ultimate price. We will stand in the financial halls of London as the British Empire, upon which the sun never set, loses its global financial dominance in a single humiliating weekend. And then we will return to the present day, to the United States of America, and you will see with stark, undeniable clarity that the final act of this ancient play has already begun. The sets are in place, the actors are on stage, and the lines are being spoken. The final countdown is no longer a prediction. It is our present reality. The first and most foundational chapter of this blueprint was written in the fires of the Roman Empire. The backbone of Rome's monumental economy was not gold, but silver, embodied in a coin known as the denarius. Introduced around 211 BC, For centuries, this coin was the bedrock of trust across the known world. At its zenith, it was a testament to Roman integrity, containing nearly 95% pure, silver or solid, tangible 4.5 grams of real value that you could hold in your hand and know, with certainty, what it was worth. For almost 300 years, as Rome maintained the denarius's integrity, its empire flourished, expanding its laws, its roads, and its culture. But the temptation, the siren song of easy money, proved irresistible to the state, just as it always does. The desire to spend more than it had, to promise its citizens more than it could deliver, to cheat the very people it was meant to serve, began to corrode the foundation. It started slowly, a barely perceptible decline. By the time of the infamous Emperor Nero, around 60 AD, the silver content had been subtly reduced to 90%. Under the noble Trajan, it fell further to 85%. The decadent Commodus, by the late 100s AD, debased it to around 70%. And by the time of the Severan dynasty in the early 200s AD, the denarius was a hollow shell, containing only 50% silver. The Roman government had discovered the secret of inflation. It could mint twice as many coins from the same amount of metal, effectively stealing 50% of the value from every citizen in an invisible, yet devastating tax. Then came the breaking point, the moment the blueprint was carved permanently into the stone of history, the crisis of the 3rd century. Emperors desperate to pay their legions and fund endless civil and frontier wars threw away all pretense of fiscal responsibility. By approximately 250 AD, the denarius was a pathetic token containing less than 5% silver. It was a copper coin given a thin, deceptive silvery wash, a finish so cheap it would rub off in the palm of your hand. But you cannot fool the people who use this money to feed their families and clothe their children. The market, the collective wisdom of millions making daily economic decisions, knew the truth. The very soldiers who were the foundation of imperial power began to mutiny, demanding their pay not in the worthless denarius, but in stable gold aurei. The economic chaos was absolute. Historians estimate that prices across the empire skyrocketed by over 1,000% in just a few decades. And here, the rule manifested with perfect clarity. A single gold coin, the aureus, which had been worth 25 denarii in the early stable empire, was now worth thousands of the debased coins. By the time Constantine finally tried to reform the shattered system, that same gold coin was worth millions of denarii. Gold had not doubled in value. The currency used to measure it had collapsed. This was the market's final, terrified verdict on Roman governance. The monetary chaos bled directly into political chaos. Between 235 and 285 AD, Rome was convulsed by a revolving door of approximately 26 emperors in just 50 years, the vast majority of them assassinated. The empire split into 3 warring fragments. Long-distance trade ground to a halt. Taxes skyrocketed to pay for the worthless money. And in many regions, the advanced economy reverted to a primitive barter system. The lesson was permanent and stark. Currency debasement leads directly to the doubling of gold, which signals the inevitable collapse of the empire. The blueprint did not die with Rome. It merely lay dormant, waiting for the next great power to rise and repeat the same fatal mistakes. We now jump forward to the 1500s, to the Spanish Empire, the undisputed superpower of its age. Its territories stretched across the globe, and most importantly, it possessed the legendary treasure fleets. It controlled Potosi in modern-day Bolivia, a literal mountain of silver, and vast gold reserves from Mexico. An unbelievable torrent of bullion was hauled across the Atlantic in Spanish galleons. At its peak, in the late 16th century, Spain was importing more than 200 tons of silver per year, a flood of wealth never before seen. Historian Earl Hamilton meticulously documented what happened next in a period known as the Price Revolution. Spain had fallen for the ultimate illusion. It believed it had discovered a cheat code for economics. It thought it didn't need to produce goods, innovate, or build a productive economy. It could simply use its vast silver hoard to buy anything it wanted from other nations. But when you flood an economy with that much new money, even real silver money, without a corresponding increase in the production of goods like food, cloth, and tools, you get one result: massive runaway inflation. From 1500 to 1600, prices across Spain quadrupled. The cost of grain, wool, and rent became crippling for the average family. Yet, even with this incredible inflow of real wealth, the Spanish government, under King Philip II, could not control its spending. He waged endless, religiously motivated wars across Europe. Funding them with massive debts that used the future silver shipments as collateral, it was never enough. The Spanish crown defaulted on its debts in 1557, again in 1575, again in 1596, and a fourth time in 1607 for sovereign defaults in just 50 years. The richest empire the world had ever known was spiritually and financially bankrupt. So, what did they do? They turned to the page in the blueprint written by Rome. They debased their own money. Spain began issuing vast quantities of pure copper coins called vellon and, by royal decree, commanded the people to accept them at the same value as the old silver coins. But the market, as always, was not fooled by government fiat. The value of gold and silver, the real money, doubled and then tripled against this new trash currency. The elites, the large landholders, the wealthy creditors, the connected nobility knew what to do. They hoarded the hard assets. They held on to the gold and silver, insulating themselves. But the middle class, the artisans, the wage earners, and the poor were completely wiped out. They were left holding bags of worthless copper, while the price of basic necessities, like bread, exploded. And what was the final outcome? Just as the rule predicts, the empire collapsed. Spain lost its dominance, its power and influence draining away to the more commercially savvy and productive Dutch and the British. Spain was left a hollowed-out shell, a cautionary tale of an empire that had held all the tangible treasure in the world and still managed to go bankrupt by following the ancient blueprint. Once again, the doubling of gold and silver was not a sign of prosperity. It was the final signal that the empire was finished. This pattern is not exclusive to the Western world, nor is it confined to the debasement of metal coins. To prove its universality, we travel to the 14th century, to the Ming dynasty of China, arguably the most advanced and sophisticated economy on Earth at the time. The Ming made a bold and, they believed, revolutionary decision. They attempted to outsmart the market itself. They abolished gold and silver as currency. In 1375, they introduced the world's first major government-mandated fiat paper currency, the Da Ming Baijiu or Great Ming Treasure Note. On paper, it was a stroke of genius, a modern tool to manage the macroeconomy, fund state projects, and create an efficient, centralized system. But what did they do when they needed more revenue? They did exactly what Rome had done. They could not resist the primitive equivalent of the printing press. To fund military expeditions and monumental construction projects, they printed more and more notes, with no regard for the underlying value. Crucially, these notes were not convertible into gold or silver. Their value was based solely on the government's promise, and by the early 15th century, that promise was revealed to be worthless. The paper money experienced a hyperinflationary collapse, losing over 99% of its original value. The people, understanding they were being robbed, simply refused to accept the notes. The government's brilliant modern experiment had failed utterly. So, what did the market, the people themselves, turn to? What did they demand as real, trustworthy money? Silver. Through sheer force of will and economic necessity, the entire Ming economy remonetized itself on silver. The government was eventually forced to capitulate to reality, even demanding that taxes be paid in silver from the 1560s onward. For a time, this new metallic base worked. As huge amounts of silver flowed in from Japan and, via the Spanish, from the New World, but in the early 17th century, the blueprint's final act began. The flow of silver stopped. Japan closed its doors to foreign trade, and a declining Spain cut off its supply. Suddenly, the Ming economy was starved of the one thing it now depended on. Silver became impossibly scarce, and its value, measured against the copper coins that peasants used for their daily transactions, didn't just double it, tripled, and quadrupled. This was the death blow. The peasants earned their living in copper, but the state demanded its taxes in silver. An impossible, unbridgeable gap opened up, wiping out the agricultural class. The resulting famine, tax-driven poverty, and mass desperation fueled a massive peasant rebellion led by Li Zi, which culminated in the toppling of the dynasty in 1644. The rule held, proving that it doesn't matter if the currency is a silver coin, a copper coin, or a paper note. When the hard, trusted asset in this case, silver doubles or more in price against the everyday money. It signals that the system is broken beyond repair and the empire falls. The blueprint lay dormant for centuries, waiting for the next global hegemon to emerge. This occurred in the 1900s with the British Empire, an entity so vast it was famously said the sun never set upon it. Its currency, the pound sterling, was the global reserve currency, backed by gold. With the City of London as the undisputed center of world finance, the pound was the denarius of its day. But, like every empire before it, the costs of war and the burden of debt began to rot the system from within. World War I forced Britain to suspend the gold standard in 1914, a measure advertised as temporary but which became a dangerous habit. The government printed money to pay for the war, diluting the pound's value. A failed attempt to return to the gold standard in the 1920s only revealed that confidence had been shattered. Then came World War II. Britain emerged victorious, but financially exhausted, wholly dependent on loans from its rising successor, the United States. At the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the new global financial system was created, but it was not built around the pound. It was built around the US dollar. The dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and all other currencies, including the pound, were pegged to the dollar. The pound was fixed at a proud but utterly artificial and overvalued rate. You cannot pretend forever. The market is a relentless truth-teller. Through the late 1940s, Britain was hemorrhaging dollar reserves. It could not export enough to pay for its imports. The entire financial world knew the pound was a facade. The breaking point arrived on September 18, 1949. In a single shocking weekend, the British government surrendered to economic reality. They announced a massive, humiliating devaluation of the pound by 30.5%, dropping its value against the dollar from $4.03 to just $2.80 overnight. Consider the profound meaning of this act. Because the US dollar was still pegged to gold, the pound had just been catastrophically devalued against gold itself. The price of gold in pounds sterling shot up by over 30% in an instant. This was the market's brutal, definitive correction. It was the signal that this was not a minor financial adjustment, but the end of the British Empire's financial reign. It was a public admission that the pound was no longer the anchor of the global economy, the torch of global reserve currency, and with it the blueprint for collapse had been passed. A massive, sudden change in the currency's gold value, followed by the end of an empire's dominance. The pattern was unbroken, and so the story shifts decisively to the United States of America. The Bretton Woods system was the grand bargain America made with the world. Trust us, and we will be the responsible steward of global finance. The dollar, we promised, is as good as gold, because we guarantee that any foreign government can exchange $35 for 1 ounce of gold upon demand. This promise made the dollar the world's indispensable reserve money, and for a post-war period, it worked. The world rebuilt, but just like Rome, just like Spain, the American empire could not resist the temptation. The temptation to be a global policeman, to build a vast welfare state, and to do it all without asking its citizens to pay the full cost. By the 1960s, the U.S. government was simultaneously funding a massive, protracted war in Vietnam and enormous new social programs at home, the guns and butter policy. It wasn't paying for this with commensurate taxes. It was paying for it by printing money. It was sending billions of dollars overseas to fund its ambitions, dollars that far exceeded the gold sitting in its vaults at Fort Knox. The rest of the world was not stupid. They could read the blueprint as well as anyone. Nations like France, under the prescient Charles de Gaulle, saw the cheating for what it was and began calling America's bluff. They started sending their accumulated dollars back to the U.S., demanding their gold in exchange, as was their contractual right. And America, to maintain the illusion, had to pay. The U.S. gold reserves, the very foundation of the entire post-war financial order, began to bleed out at an alarming rate. The pressure became unbearable. By 1971, a line was forming at the gold window. The game was over. Then came the pivotal moment in modern financial history. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on national television and announced to a stunned world that the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. He closed the gold window. With that one speech, he unilaterally tore up the Bretton Woods contract, the US dollar, and by extension, every major currency on earth that was pegged to it. became pure fiat money backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the issuing government, which is to say, backed by nothing tangible at all. What happened next was the most important economic event of the last half-century, and it perfectly followed the historical script. Gold was unshackled. Its price, which had been artificially suppressed at $35 an ounce for decades, was finally set free to tell the truth about the dollar's debasement. The truth was brutal. By 1973, the price of gold had doubled to over $70. By 1974, it had reached $180. And by the peak of the crisis in 1980, it had skyrocketed to over $800 an ounce. The doubling moment was the signal, the canary in the coal mine. And just as it had for Rome, Spain, and Britain, that signal marked the beginning of the end for the empire's monetary supremacy. August 15, 1971, was the day the empire's money officially broke, and it started the final countdown for the US dollar's dominance. That act set the entire globe on a new, uncharted course. For the first time in all of human history, all major money on earth was purely fiat, backed only by the faith and credit of governments, and primarily by faith in the United States. But faith, as we have seen through to millennia of history, is the most fragile of all foundations. Fast forward to today. After the dot-com bust, the 2008 global financial crisis, 2 decades of endless foreign wars, and the unprecedented multi-trillion-dollar money printing of the COVID-19 era, that faith is now collapsing. The U.S. national debt is an unpayable, exponentially growing monster that threatens to consume the entire economy. The system is rotting from within. Just like Rome's in the 3rd century, people feel the debasement in their daily lives in the soaring cost of housing, in the price of groceries, in the feeling that their paycheck buys less and less each month. They know intuitively that something is fundamentally wrong, and right on cue, as if scripted, a new miraculous digital solution appears on the horizon, promising salvation. A digital gold, a stateless, decentralized, peer-to-peer electronic cash system called Bitcoin. It is presented as the ultimate escape hatch from the corrupt, failing fiat system, a way to opt out of government control and protect your wealth in a neutral, mathematical network. It is a brilliant, captivating, and empowering story. And it is, I believe, the single greatest financial deception ever crafted. You must ask yourself a simple, logical question. In a hyper-connected, surveilled world where the powers that be, the central banks, the intelligence agencies, the regulatory bodies control the foundational layers of our society, how does a technology that supposedly strips them of their most vital power, the exclusive control over money, simply appear out of nowhere, created by a nameless, faceless, and utterly unaccountable ghost? It is a trap. It is a digital snare designed with exquisite precision to catch all the people who were just smart enough to see the collapse of the fiat system coming, but not wise enough to see the real solution that history has always provided. Think critically about what Bitcoin truly depends on for its existence and utility. It requires the internet, a global infrastructure that is ultimately controlled and can be regulated, throttled, or segmented by governments. It requires the massive centralized power grid to run its energy-intensive mining operations, an infrastructure they absolutely control. And most critically, for it to have any measurable value in the real world. It requires digital exchanges and banking on-ramps, centralized, vulnerable companies that governments can shut down, freeze, or seize with a single phone call or court order. They could render its value to zero, not by hacking the immutable code, but by simply cutting the on-ramps and off-ramps. They can make it illegal to transact in it. They can impose confiscatory taxes on its gains. And they can use the very transparency of its blockchain to identify and monitor every major participant. It is the perfect honeypot. They have watched for over a decade, letting it grow, identifying every single person, every corporation, and every nation-state that is looking for an exit from the dollar system. And they have convinced them to trade their real, hard-earned wealth for a string of code on a digital ledger that they can ultimately control access to. It is a digital ghost. You cannot hold it in your hand. You cannot bury it in your backyard. You cannot pass it to your child without an electronic intermediary. And if you cannot physically possess it without any intermediary, you do not truly own it. You are merely renting access to it from the system. So, if the promised digital escape is an elaborate trap, what is the real arc? What is the blueprint that the truly ancient and powerful families, the old money, have always used to survive this exact moment in the civilizational cycle? It is the one they never discuss in the mainstream media, the one you cannot create with a keystroke, and the one they cannot delete with a line of code or a regulatory decree. It is the only form of value that has survived every single empire's collapse for over 5,000 years. It is physical gold, tangible silver, and other real productive assets. This is the generational arc. While the system is busy herding the masses into a digital corral, a fascinating and telling phenomenon is occurring at the highest levels. The oldest and most powerful financial families, and most revealingly, the central banks themselves. What are they doing? They are not accumulating Bitcoin. They are buying physical gold in record unprecedented amounts. They are actively repatriating their gold holdings from vaults in New York and London. Getting the physical metal back within their own sovereign borders and under their direct control, they are telling the public a story of digital innovation and a cashless society. While they are doing the complete opposite, building fortresses of tangible wealth, their actions are the only signal you need to see. When Rome's denarius collapsed, the wealthy held gold and vast agricultural estates. When the French assignat became worthless paper during the Revolution, the people who survived and thrived were the ones who had hidden a few gold Louis d'Or coins. When the British pound was devalued in 1949, those who held gold saw their wealth protected overnight. This is the timeless playbook. Gold is the ultimate defense. It is the insurance policy against the mathematical certainty of fiat collapse. It doesn't necessarily make you spectacularly rich in the boom times. Its primary function is to keep you from being made poor in the bust. Silver is the people's money, the transactional metal that is divisible, practical, and has been used in daily trade for millennia. And then there are the other real assets, the strategic rare earth metals essential for the technological world they are building, and most importantly, productive land. Things you can stand on, things you can touch, things that produce real food and real resources. You must understand that the coming transfer of wealth is not about finding the next hot digital token that will 100x in value. It is about the fundamental act of protecting what you have already earned from the systematic debasement that they have already triggered. It is about consciously trading their deteriorating paper promises and their vulnerable digital ghosts for real, enduring, tangible world value. The foundational rule of survival in the coming storm is this: if you cannot hold it in your hand without permission from any third party, you do not own it. The blueprint is clear. The signal has been given. Gold has doubled and more against the world's reserve currencies since they broke their final link to it. The empire's money is broken. The only question that remains is whether you will be on the receiving end of this great wealth transfer, moving your value into the timeless arc of the tangible, or if you will be counted among the countless millions throughout history who were left, like the desperate citizens of Rome, holding a fistful of worthless, corroded coins, wondering how it all went so wrong.